Hey, good morning, guys. How we doing today? Today, we're going to do the second edition of valuable versus invaluable. And invaluable, of course, means it's absolutely of the essence and essential. Valuable, of course, means it's valuable. I enjoyed the first one. People seem to get a pretty good response to it. My series on 1960, I'm working on it. I'll have it for you early in the week, part one. But today I want to talk about two records again. One that's indispensable and a legend and pretty famous, and one that's going to be a little bit more second tier in terms of notoriety, but to me it's still a fantastic record and a perfect session for this morning. First record I want to talk about with you is Columbia's Thelonious Monk album, just titled Monk, number 2291 in the Columbia discography. It puts it late 64, early 65. It features Charlie Rouse, who was pretty entrenched with Monk at this point, and is probably the great tenor player that Monk ever played with in terms of being in unison and being compatible with what Monk was doing. Most guys were playing catch-up. I mean, even Coltrane, it was like mind-opening when he played with Monk, and it was a revelation every day, an epiphany all the time, versus a guy kind of in lockstep with Monk. And somehow Charlie Rouse just seems to get Monk and know his angles and his corners and his blocks and his timings, and there's a real effortless nature to Rouse playing over top of Monk, which you certainly don't hear from a lot of guys when they play over Monk. A lot of guys are almost like, I'm just going to sit out till it's my turn to play, and then come in, hopefully I'm not doing it wrong. We just heard Rouse playing there, and it sounds great at the high end of that tenor right there. This is Liza, All the Clouds Roll Away. This is one of his famous records from his years on Columbia. He, of course, spends years at Riverside. If you've not seen my two-part, three-part series on Monk, I did it last spring. It's worth watching. He's one of the real geniuses of this music. And for me, he's one of the four guys on the Mount Rushmore of jazz, along with Armstrong, Ellington, and Parker. He's so innovative and so changes the approach of the music. He opens up the door for all the avant-garde, all the minimalism, all the left-hand alternative music that's about to come out, first in jazz, but then eventually across the musical world. Monk is the guy conducting those turn signals. He's a really important factor in reshaping harmonic structure and saying, I can do some syncopation, some interesting time signatures, all while staying within the groove. I can dissect and disseminate the chords and just minimalize a first and a seventh, a first and a fourth. I might not even do the whole basic 1-3-5 chord ever. I might do alterations on that, and then when you least expect it, I might give you that root and give you back that anchor. But he's a very interesting guy in his approach to both rhythm and melody, and like I said, I think he's more important than any of the avant-garde guys. They all get their inkling of what they can do from Monk. Even Ornette Coleman, even John Coltrane, Monk, even Mingus. Monk is a huge stepping stone in the development of the abstract. And one of the things he does is he takes what Parker innovates with bebop, and that's playing all of the steps in the ladder of the scale. The chord is 1-3-5 or 1-3-7. Parker said, I'm going to play every step in that ladder to get to 7. All 7, 8, 9 notes. I'm going to use them all because they're going to still resonate, because they're going to be in that key, in that scale. But I'm not just going to limit myself in my melodic and my harmonic structuring to playing just the notes of the chord. And Monk comes along and says, well, that's interesting, Charlie. And I'm going to take those 11 notes you just dropped, and I'm going to take the 1, the 4, and the 8. The 1, the 2, and the 7. The 1, the 3, and the 6. And then maybe I'll give you that 1-3-7. 135. Like he's reducing the elements of Parker into a smaller, minimal, angular phrasing. And whereas Parker's going to be these long, lyrical, expressive narrations, like a Clifford Brown, Monk's more of a short storyteller. He's just telling you little bits and pieces. He's that guy that doesn't want to give you a lot of details. Yeah, I met her. Oh yeah, she was alright. I don't got too much to say about that. And in the same record, he does a beautiful version of April in Paris. And he's so capable of filling a lot of space, just him. In spite of his minimalism, he can just sit there and let a note hang in space like a cloying cloud of sexual vapor. It's a really unique thing that Monk's approach was about. And for those of you who aren't too knowledgeable about Monk, his early recordings of Blue Note and Prestige went fairly unnoticed in the 49, 50, 52 era. He's playing with some giants, including Sonny Rollins and just a lot of the big guys, Blakey, Kenny Clark. He's playing with a lot of the giants. And he goes back to the days at Minton's of the earliest forms of bebop. But again, Monk is distilling the bebop thing down to the Monk essence. And the Monk essence is different than what Parker and Dizzy were doing. He's capable of doing long phrases, but he limits those, which actually increases the impact of a long trill from him, because it's such a rare thing for him to do. His impact on everybody in the piano world is immense, from Bud Powell to guys like Herbie Nichols. It's a pretty long list. He's one of the great New York piano players, and if you watch my episode on the great New York piano players, there's like 15 of them. And Monk is very much at the root of that whole sound, and he deserves a lot of recognition. And he, of course, moves to Riverside, does that great Ellington record, Monk Alone, where it's just him. Then he makes Brilliant Corners, and Brilliant Corners was kind of a real corner. It turned his career. The critics finally got it. They started lauding him. He lost his cabaret license for a while, so he wasn't playing, so he was just recording. It was a secret that took a long time to get out. But eventually Columbia, the great big nationwide label that had been taking chances with Gigi Grice and Donald Byrd, taking chances with Arthur Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, taking chances with Miles Davis. In 60-61, they signed Monk. And this is probably his 5th or 6th record for Columbia. And being on Columbia, these records have a fairly large cachet and recognition. People are familiar with his name. If you were in record clubs, if you were in record stores, you would always see his releases. So he's not in any way the unknown that a lot of guys say at Blue Note, like a Duke Pearson or a Horace Parlan, Red Garland even. Those guys are more jazz fans only know about. But if you are any kind of music fan at all, the name Thelonious Monk comes to your tongue fairly quickly and crawls in your ear fairly quickly. Even if you don't listen to him or know his music, you know his name. And it's not a name you forget really either, Thelonious Monk. It just has that air of significance to it. Again, April in Paris is gorgeous. That Old Man is on here. He does a version of Pananica on here that's great. Teo, I Love You, Just Me. The whole group here is Charlie Rouse. And Rouse is probably one of the reasons why he's so efficient at playing with Monk. That little dissonant trill he does there. Is he doesn't mind sitting out for 4 or 5 minutes at times while Monk feels his ideations unfolding. And Rouse is probably just sitting back there going, okay, gotcha, I see what you're saying, feel it. And then you have Larry Gale on the bass and Ben Riley on the drums. And so it's a great Columbia session from 64-65 era. his fame is kind of increasing, even as his innovation is kind of decreasing some. He's certainly more innovative during his Riverside era, but unlike Miles, he doesn't go to Columbia and just start making records that are widely accessible and change his direction to some degree. He still is very much Monk, even here in 64, 65. He's been touring Europe, he's been in Italy, he's been in France, he's been all over Europe. The European audiences loved him. He's coming back to America, and America's really not quite enveloped in jazz anymore. Jazz has kind of become sidelined. Beatlemania's happened, Motown's becoming huge, soul music in general is starting to become very popular, R&B, Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, of course Elvis has happened, all the great classic rock groups are starting to come on the scene in 64, 65, so jazz has been very marginalized, but this record has really stood the test of time, and I feel like it's easily one of the greatest records he does on Columbia, and probably one of his top 10 records ever. But because it gets so much more exposure, it's definitely a pretty famous album. This is That Old Man, a nice swinging number where Rouse gets to kind of carry the fort for a while. I find Monk on ballads to be quite compelling. It's in the ballad setting where you realize just how spatial his playing is. And it's almost like a singer telling you a very short narration. He doesn't need to be super elongated and eloquent. He's kind of to the point and succinct. And you can hear some of the New York stride piano players in his playing at times. Going back to the Fats Waller or James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith. You can even hear some of Art Tatum at times. And Tatum, of course, is the guy that Parker, when he first went to New York City, heard playing every night, washing dishes. Parker was in the back of the bar, washing and trying to find a job, and he was listening to Tatum play every night. And you have to know that that had some impact on Parker. And of course, Parker's already done a lot of his innovations in KC, but Tatum, to some people's mind, is one of the real roots of bebop. Because of how he played harmonically, how he played melodically, his long, fluid lines that seemed to make the piano an effortless extension of his fingers. Tatum was a special player. And you can even hear elements of Tatum in Monk. And Tatum's one of the most underappreciated names in jazz today. Collectors don't buy his stuff. His stuff's mostly from the pre-LP era. He was a blind cat that could shred a piano. And stuff on Verve is great. His stuff on Columbia is great. I think most of the stuff that's on Columbia was actually issued on smaller labels originally. But Tatum was holding down 57th Street in the 50s. You know, he's still alive and a vital player on the scene. So Monk is a great record. It's indispensable. It's invaluable. It's a record that every collector should strive to own. Now the second record I want to cover in today's episode, a bit of a different vibe. And that's the great Sunday Morning by Grant Green. And those of you who watch me for any length of time know how big a Grant Green fan I am. I'm actually a huge fan of guitar jazz in general. And I think the greatest thing that happens to jazz in the 60s is the resurgence of jazz guitar. It's somewhat marginalized during the bebop era. Charlie Christian, of course, brings bebop to the guitar, you know, and there's guys out there who are playing with some of that essence, you know. Wes Montgomery was a brilliant player with a really original chord phrasing and structuring. My friend Wolfgang can tell you more about that than I can. To me, Kenny Burrell plays bebop fairly well at times. Grant Green's not a bebop player. Grant Green's a soul, R&B, blues, gospel-infused jazz player. And soul jazz isn't so much this new invention as it is a returning to the roots of jazz, gospel and the blues. And so the idea that soul jazz was this new thing that came along in the 60s and watered down jazz, that's not the case. The jazz that soul jazz is playing is rooted firmly in the gospel and the blues that jazz is rooted in. And if there's anything that's kind of different about the soul jazz era, it was the advent of the organ. And of course there's organ players going back into the swing era. You know, Fats Waller dabbled on the organ. There's guys during that era that played organ. But organ certainly comes to the foreground in the late 50s with Jimmy Smith at Blue Note. And it leads to just a prodigious number of organ players turning up at labels like Prestige and at Blue Note. There's quite a few of them. John Patton, Don Patterson, Johnny Hammond Smith, Babyface Willette. There's just a lot of organ players that show up on the scene in the 60s especially. And the nice thing about the organ players is they almost always feature guitar players. And if you're going to enjoy an organ record, you're going to get some great guitar playing. And a lot of those records don't have horns. They reduce the sound to the guitar and the organ with bass and drums. And sometimes the organ will play the bass with the pedals. So it can often be a trio with guitar, drummer, and an organ player. It gave guys like Grant Green a lot of work. Grant Green wasn't, like I said, a bebop guy. He's firmly rooted in those long single note lines. Just plays a soulful sound that seeps out of those pickups, and he just is light and spry and bluesy. And Kenny Drew plays the piano on this, so it's not an organ record, but Kenny Drew to me is one of the most unheralded guys in the scene. Another New York piano player. He goes to Europe shortly after this, and that's going to leave a dearth of a shortcoming of American recordings for Kenny Drew, and that kind of minimizes his popularity here in America because our exposure to European record labels and our really American interest in anything outside of the borders of America is pretty minimal. You know, we haven't really gave too much of a damn about anything anybody else's politics, you know, movies, music. It's rare. You know, Beatlemania was a unique phenomenon for us to see something from the outside. And the odd thing about Beatlemania, it was pretty much giving us American music back to America through white British kids. You know, the black music in this country has been so instrumental in shaping the music of the 20th century into the 21st century. Again, the political climate today is a reflection of these times. It's an age-old formula that those in power have just strove hard to maintain. The second we have racial unity, the second we have political unity, where left and right, urban, rural, all those things kind of fade, and we start trusting each other and recognizing we have kind of a shared common interest, change can be effective. And the institutions that are in place don't want change. They want the status quo to remain. And an enlightened, educated populace that's interacting and not seeing division could effectively democratically make a lot of change happen. But in a climate of fear, in a climate of tension, in a climate of lacking trust and understanding, the division is all we see. It's all we have time to even talk about. And the fear dictates all policy will remain the same. And that's the agenda. That's what we need to understand. It's not the headline that's important, it's the fear that it sells. It's the discord that it's creating. That's the agenda. And this black music is so a product of that in those days, and it still reflects it today, and we can still see the discord today. The NBA, baseball, there's all these turmoil in sports today. Another black guy was gunned down. Small towns. Another black guy was gunned down trying to get into his car, and you think it was shot like 12 times, and there's just not justice, and they don't go out of their way to prevent us from seeing the inequality. They want us to see how unjust and unfair this is, because it'll outrage the people on the left, including the minorities. They're going to feel outraged and frightened, and then those on the right will be angry, saying, well, you shouldn't be so outraged. If you weren't criminals, you wouldn't. Again, the fear. And this music is why the blues exists. This political climate is why the blues exists. Ben Dixon plays the drums, Ben Tucker's on the bass. And what you're hearing here is very clearly what Grant Green's about. It's frisky, nice briskness. It's never too heavy and cloying. It's kind of light. And he just kind of has his clean tone. And remember, the cleaner your tone is, the more imperfections you can hear. And he just finds that center of the note with each of his little picks. And like I said, I love Grant Green. He might not be the most technically proficient player in this music, but he's probably the bluesiest, probably the most gospel drenched, and he's probably in the setting that allows his guts and his feeling and his blues to most be centered. Wes Montgomery's a victim of recording for Verve and just doesn't have a lot of great sessions, and there's a lot of great records in Wes's catalog, don't get me wrong, but I think it doesn't really give Wes a great reflection of who he might actually have been. Whereas you get to know Grant Green through his recordings. Blue Note allows the blues to shine, allows the gospel to come out. Even the name Sunday Morning, it just tells you how gospel inflected this record's going to be. Exodus, Sunday Morning, God Bless the Child, Come Sunrise. They're all sun-drenched gospel tracks. That's Sunday Morning. A nice up-tempo blues. There's Exodus. And if I recall, Exodus was from a film, and the song became a hit, and everybody started doing versions of it. This is his fourth record for Blue Note, number, I haven't wrote it down yet, 4099. And he shows up early in the 4000 series, 1961, and he makes a pretty incredible stream of records for Blue Note all the way through to the early 70s. And they've actually increased quite a lot in value these last 10 years. Grant Green records, with the exception of his first few, his records used to not be that expensive. The first few, Grandstand, Green Street, those ones would be always kind of desired and hard to find. But his later stuff sold okay for Blue Note, and that's very, it's very Blue Note scale-wise, it sold well. Doesn't sell well compared to what Columbia was doing by any means, but you could still find his later stuff, and see it in stores, and go to a section in the record store and find a couple of his 70s albums, and that's pretty much dried up. They're all now on eBay or Discogs for 40, 50, 60, 70 bucks. And I remember seeing Live at the Lighthouse or Grant Green Alive in record stores for 12 bucks. Those days are gone. So I'm a big fan of Grant. I did a great episode of him probably early last spring, so you should look that up if you haven't seen it. But that's two records I really love. One that's pretty famous, and one that's not so well known, but is deserving of it. Hope you're enjoying this series. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you enjoy the content and you want to support, please go to Patreon and pledge as little as $5 a month to help out the channel. like I said, I just appreciate you all. Y'all be safe.